Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Family Lawyer podcast. Today we are talking about the impact of the legal aid agency hack on firms and the impact that it's had on individuals as well. First reported back in May of this year, the hack has subsequently been found to have impacted a huge number of people. And of course, there are lots and lots of firms out there that have similarly been impacted. We're chatting, it's towards the end of the summer. We're chatting now at a point in time when I think there are lots of workarounds in place, and it's fair to say, but nothing yet really concrete that's going to make life much easier for professionals. And I'm delighted to welcome Beverley Watkins onto the podcast, managing partner of Watkins Solicitors. It's great to have you here, Beverley. Thanks so much for joining.
Happy to join.
I'm going to ask you who you are and what you do in just a second, and particularly in the context of the fact that your firm does a huge amount of legal aid work. You're also vice chair of the Legal Aid Practitioners Group. It'd be interesting to hear kind of what that involves and how that's worked alongside the agency over the course of the last few months. So tell us a little bit about yourself, please, Beverley, and what you do.
Well, I'm the managing partner of Watkins Solicitors. In 1998, I decided to set up a predominantly legal aid firm, carrying out work, family and education initially. And the firm has always had a large proportion of legal aid work. We're very reliant on legal aid work, and it's become harder and harder because the rates that we're paid when I first qualified went up every April in line with inflation. But since 1996, the rates have not gone up at all. And in fact, for some areas of work, in 2011, there was a huge cut. Name me any other profession which has not had a rate increase for nearly 30 years. Nobody can. You know, different professionals have been during this summer campaigning for increases in rates in line with inflation. We are, I think, legal aid practitioners and the legal aid community is at breaking point. There is no doubt about it. I think that most people involved in legal aid work, obviously they do it because they are passionate about the clients. We do it for the clients, no other reason, because goodness me, we certainly don't do it for the money. The cyber attack has really come on top of everything else that we have to deal with. So it's been a very difficult few months. And I think probably the cyber attack is symbolic of the failure of repeated governments, of whatever persuasion, to put money into legal aid. We as practitioners have to have very secure systems in order to carry out legal aid work. We have to have double authenticated access to systems, but it seems that the legal aid agency did not. So it's not only worrying really for practitioners, but clients, because what isn't clear at the moment is the extent to which personal documents, very confidential documents, when you think about our legal aid clients, so they could be people who are prosecuted for crimes, very serious crimes, but perhaps not convicted, victims of domestic abuse. You've then got care proceedings where obviously involves young children who may have been abused. And there's very confidential information that would have been retained by the legal aid agency. In some cases, it could be, in the case of victims of domestic abuse, it could be confidential addresses or locations or areas. The whole cyber attack has been deeply troubling and very worrying.
The Ministry of Justice has indicated that in excess of 2 million records could well be affected and more. It goes back as far as 2007 in terms of the data that's been accessed. So yeah, wholeheartedly take your point about the extent of the hack. What I wanted to kind of drill into in the course of the discussion today was the impact that it's had on you as a firm. And I recognise the fees issue. That is an entirely different podcast in itself, absolutely no doubt about it. But, you know, in the first instance, how were you informed about the hack? Were you informed about the cyber attack? And how did it impact you operationally from the outset?
To be honest, I can't remember how I first heard. I think it was an email, and I can't remember where the comms came from. Initially, there was one of absolute horror. And also, of course, none of us understood how long the whole closure of the legal aid portal was going to last. So if it was going to last a couple of days, it would be inconvenient. A couple of weeks, oh my gosh. But obviously we're months down the line and it's still not really resolved. So I think that the real problem at the beginning was none of us knew the extent or how long it was going to last. And the initial procedures put in by the Ministry of Justice were simply to really keep emergency cases going. So we could sort of deal with emergency cases, but that was it. And then as it's gone on, other contingency procedures have been put into place. So it has evolved. I mean, when it first happened, I thought it was a bit like the pandemic in that I sort of held my head and thought, how are we going to get through this? What do we have to do? And then you kind of make a list of what you need to do and how you might get through it. And like with the pandemic, I mean, I must admit, I thought when we first had that sort of lockdown, it will last a couple of weeks and we'll be back to normal. It was the same with this. To be honest, I lost more sleepless nights through the cyber attack than I did when we first had lockdown and the pandemic and we didn't know what it was going to do, because it wasn't clear how we were going to be paid. I know, kind of gone on about the failure to increase rates in legal aid. What that means is legal aid firms, they are functioning and they're operating on incredibly low margins. Some of the work we do is clearly not profitable at all. We make a loss on it and we hope that another case might kind of pay out to cover it. And when you're operating on such fine margins, what you can't cope with is suddenly not having your regular income. So that was the major worry, is how are we going to pay our staff? I immediately, I'll be honest, I contacted the bank, who we have quite a good relationship with. I said, look, legal aid has had a cyber attack. I do not know if we can meet the wages this month. And I was terrified that we wouldn't have enough money in the bank to pay the salaries. And then, of course, we also owe monies, not owe, but every month you've got overheads. How are we going to pay overheads? Salaries is always, the one you're concerned about most, because you can hardly say to staff, thanks for all your work during the last month. It's been fabulous. You've all been great. But actually, we won't be paying you this month because there's been a cyber attack and we don't have the money to pay you. That's never going to work because staff have bills to pay. That was the major worry. So I think on day one, I contacted the bank and said, look, don't know how long this is going to last. I don't know what the impact's going to be, but we may need help. And they were very good, actually.
What about the impact on staff and particularly on morale? Because as you've alluded to, legal aid work is fairly downtrodden already, and certainly, we've met plenty of legal aid lawyers who've got plenty to say about that. But surely this is, like you say, it's another kick in the teeth, almost the straw that breaks the camel's back.
I think initially nobody knew what to do. So we had a procedure for emergency cases, but then we were terrified we might not get paid, in 3 months' time. For example, in domestic abuse, there is, if you like, a threshold or a line that we look at before we think about commencing court proceedings. I think for some firms I'm aware of, they just decided not to do emergency work because they were terrified they wouldn't be paid at the end of the case. So some victims of domestic abuse may have struggled to find anyone to represent them. And one of the problems is with domestic abuse, quite often in cases, there is a timeline where it starts with harassment, it then moves to stalking before it becomes a serious threat to the physical well-being of clients. Not in every case. So some of those cases which might have been considered more lower level harassment, and solicitors may have been cautious and concerned about taking on emergency work, those clients may have gone unrepresented, but then you don't know what happens down the line, because it's often, as I say, it's a timeline of abuse that gets worse and worse. And there were other clients who it wasn't an emergency as such, it wasn't domestic abuse, but they had court hearings coming up and we simply just couldn't, or we had difficulties in justifying trying ourselves to say this is an emergency. So there were a lot of clients in those first months who we simply didn't take on as clients, we didn't represent, and they may have gone to court and represented themselves.
What have you made of the legal aid agency's responses? Slightly incendiary question, I guess, but you said at the outset you weren't really sure how long it might last. You have some sympathy for the legal aid agency because, cyber attack is a cyber attack. How long's a piece of string? But their response is really important. How have you kind of thought they've dealt with this?
We all know that family law cases can be complicated, which is why you and your client deserve reliable, hassle-free drug and alcohol testing services. From hair testing to abstinence monitoring, we can help. Visit lextalks.co.uk for more information.
Well, the first few weeks there were almost comms every day, and there were new regulations, and I must admit a lot of us got confused about what we should be doing when, and how might we have emergency legal aid, how we might be paid. So there was a lot of confusion to begin with. There's two things we need now as things have moved on. We need to know when we're going to be able to submit bills, because at the moment we have no way of submitting bills, and that's the crucial thing for cash flow. Staff have been incredible, really, in the sense that what's now happening is on new applications. Sometimes, if I explain that sometimes when the client has a legal aid certificate, it might cover one set of proceedings, and then something happens, you need to make an amendment to cover another set of proceedings. And what we would have done prior to the cyber attack is make an amendment on their portal or request an amendment. But now what staff are having to do is essentially fill out a paper application, which is what happened probably pre-2010. It was all paper applications, and then scan them and email them to the legal aid agency, and they deal with it that way. And of course, some of the young things in the office they're not quite used to pen and paper, because they're very much digital based.
Digital natives, yes.
Digital natives. To begin with, there was a lot of confusion, and also they're using the old paper forms, some of which have questions which aren't relevant. So the young things were saying, but what about this question? And I'm just saying, forget it, because it's not relevant. But they didn't, so the forms were a bit sort of through them because they weren't used to filling them out. We've sort of got used to that. Everyone needs to know desperately is, when will it end? When will it end? That's what we really want to know. And really, we've got all of these bills, that we're very keen to submit, because it's cash flow. The longer it goes on, the more administratively difficult it's going to be. Can you imagine if you were a self-employed person, and every time you bought a newspaper or bought something, you got petrol or a train ticket or a bus ticket, and you kept them all in a plastic bag, and then suddenly after 9 months you had to submit them all in an orderly form? Now, we're not keeping everything in a plastic bag, but what we've got is all these different cases, some of which have claims for translation fees or process service fees, and they all have to be in a certain order. Now, if they're not correct, they get rejected by the legal aid agency, and there's a real concern that when the portal or when the gates open, they will be inundated with bills from firms all over the country. They're not going to be able to cope. How long is it going to take them to go through it? And then if there is an issue with the bill, we're now 9 months, possibly a year after the case finished, that we've then got to backtrack and try and sort out whatever the issue was. So I think there's a real concern about what happens when the gates open, because everybody is going to want to get their bills to the front of the queue.
I know you've been on national radio, you've been on local radio as well, Bev. You've been very transparent about the impact that it's had on your firm. I mean, can you kind of share the impact it's had on you financially as an organisation?
We're keeping going at the moment, and in 2013, we were 84% legal aid, and we then moved, and we're now about 44% legal aid. I think the impact on those firms where there's a bigger portion of legal aid is going to be much greater, but it's very hard. We've had to cut back on certain things. There isn't a lot of fripperies in a legal aid firm, so it's difficult. I have to say that a lot of organisations that we work with, such as translation companies or process servers, understand that there is a difficulty because of getting money from the legal aid agency, and all of them have been quite patient about us not paying them immediately, whereas before we would pay them pretty quickly. So we've put off paying Peter and we're holding off paying Paul in the hope that, we will get the funds shortly.
What about your role in this legal aid practitioners group? It's I guess it's a pressure group. Have you been working with the legal aid agency to support them with their comms? What role does the LAPG play in this particular scenario, and then more broadly with the legal aid agency?
Well, the Legal Aid Practitioners Group, the organisation itself employs a number of people who've been directly involved in discussions with the Legal Aid Agency. So not myself. And those who work for LAPG have been very active in putting forward the problems, the queries, the questions from practitioners. So that a lot of practitioners, if you like, have fed in and given them feedback so they can go with one voice rather than the legal aid agency have to deal with sort of 100 different firms. That there is a voice that can and it can put forward the voices of all legal aid firms. Legal Aid Practitioners Group have also put out very regularly some excellent comms about what the latest situation is and when we might expect things to change.
We're 4 or 5 months down the line. This is clearly having a continued impact on your organisation. I mean, do you expect things to change massively in the short and medium term?
I'm hoping so. I thank the gods that are out there that we didn't have an end of the financial year in the middle of it, because that would have been a complete nightmare. And I know some firms would, because what's happened is we have received what's called a contingency payment. So they've taken the average of the last 3 months. So they've just given us a fee. Let's just call it £10,000. So every week we've got a contingency fee of £10,000. So that's 40,000 a month. What then happens is we can't allocate that to any cases. So it has to go into what might be called a suspense account. Now, when this all ends and we submit a bill, they will then deduct it from the monies they've given us in contingency and we can allocate it to the case. But the amount of work our accounts department's going to do is going to be phenomenal, because we've now got this suspense account and we've then got to submit bills, take it from there, allocate it. And suddenly we're going to be faced with a huge VAT bill, because at the moment, with the contingency fees, VAT isn't payable on it because it's not allocated to any services. So all the contingency doing is keeping us going. But I'm terrified that we're going to get this huge VAT bill at one point. So the accountancy side is going to be huge. And the other problem we've got, we employ somebody full time to deal with legal aid bills. Well, at the moment, they haven't really got very much to do. So we've had to try and find other work for them to do. So that's been a problem. But once the gates open, they are going to be rushed off their feet. Accounts are going to be trying to trawl through all of these old bills and allocate the monies we have received in the correct order. We know that there is going to be a lot of work down the road, a lot of work that we probably won't be paid for by the legal aid agency.
Sure. What about lessons that we've learned through this process? I mean, you allude to the pandemic, and of course, there were a huge number of lessons that were learned through the pandemic. What lessons do you take away as a firm? And then perhaps by extension, what lessons do you think legal aid practice takes away from this cyber attack? Apart from don't let it happen in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a question to ask the legal aid agency, because they've caused this. What lessons are they taking away? How are they going to make sure that it doesn't happen again? I think for us, it just emphasises more and more, can we continue to do legal aid work? Is it too risky? Even though we believe passionately about the service we provide for our clients, can we realistically carry on this type of work?
That's really interesting. I mean, do you potentially then foresee that this will see a reduction in the number of firms that will do legal aid?
Yes, I definitely do. Yes, because for a lot of people, they've just said it's the straw that breaks the camel's back, really.
It's astonishingly sad to think that this could be the end of what we understand as legal aid as it is right now. And of course, like you've said, the fact that there simply isn't the funding for it makes scenarios like this all the more difficult to deal with. There are, interestingly, some ongoing discussions about how legal aid could be funded in the future. There's a round table that I see has been reported about potentially targeting client account interest money to fund legal aid. That seems quite an extreme option?
Somebody along the line hasn't yet worked out then that the interest we receive on client account, we give to the clients. We don't keep the interest. It's handed to the client. So, for example, if we reach a settlement, I'm going to use easy figures because I was never very good at maths, but if we receive a 20,000 settlement for a client, but we then have to keep it for 3 months for whatever reason, because it's going to be used for something or other, at the end of that 3 months, we give them the interest we have received. We don't keep the interest, so there's no money to hand over. I think that it's difficult because as a society, we need to decide, do we want to live in a country where people who are victims of domestic abuse, for example, which is a huge area of work that we deal with, are represented in court proceedings. When I qualified, which is only a few years ago, I think that it was something like 47% of the country were eligible for legal aid. Now, they may have had to make a contribution towards legal aid, but financially, a lot of people were eligible. Now it's a really small percentage of people who are eligible for legal aid. They have to really be on a very low income or universal credit, which means there's those that have a large bank balance who can pay for lawyers. And then there is a big gap, really, the difference between what clients, and I'm going to say it's not always, but it's often the men in a relationship separation who have the highly paid job and have the capital to pay privately for a lawyer. And it is often the women who might not be working full time because they have other duties, who are on much lower income, that the men are paying maybe 5, 6, 7, whatever times what legal aid pay. There's such a difference now between what somebody pays for a private solicitor and a legal aid, or what a legal aid solicitor receives. So that concerns me, because I think that then produces an inequality of arms. But you have that group in the middle who may not be eligible for legal aid, who simply can't afford to have representation. And in family cases, when I first qualified, it was very rare that I went to court and both sides were not represented. Both sides would always be represented, and cases were dealt with quickly and speedily, because solicitors, we're not all sort of Ron Paul of the Bailey trying to score points. We're there to try and resolve matters so that those families, they may not love each other anymore, but they will go off and make arrangements for their children. They're in the best interests of the children. Whereas now, there are many cases I deal with where one party isn't represented and they keep going with family proceedings, I think, because nobody has given them any independent advice to say that try and resolve this matter. Do not keep proceeding on a point of principle, because at the end of the day, often you've got children involved. So I think that the fact that legal aid is in such dire straits and has not been funded properly for so many years is a cause for concern, and particularly as to what's going to happen next. It's difficult, isn't it? Because there's so many pools on the coffers at number 11 Downing Street. And I think that probably legal aid lawyers are pretty much way down the list and near the bottom. So it's difficult, but I think that we have to try and say that it is important.
There seem to be some rather fundamental choices that need to be made, not too dissimilar perhaps to, if we're going to take a larger scale operation, the NHS, for example, and not something that we're ever going to resolve in the course of a 25-minute podcast, I have to say, Bev. But as we come to the end of the time we have together, I'm very appreciative of your time in sharing your story around the cyber attack on the Legal Aid Agency. I was explaining before we started the recording that one of the things I'm very proud of through the podcast is that whole shared experience and importance of helping people who are listening to understand that they're not the only people that are going through this, and to lean on others as well as they go through challenging times. So thank you very much indeed for joining.
You're welcome.
The Today's Family Lawyer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk. My thanks to Bev. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.